Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to introduce our next guest because Vanita Gupta is a true champion of change. I know a lot of people in this room know her. If you do, you know that she's the first Asian American to be sworn in as the U.S. Associate Attorney General, which is the third highest ranking official in the Justice Department. You already know that she's a legal powerhouse, that she's a civil rights warrior, and that she served at the Department of Justice under 2 presidents. She worked at the ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Fresh out of law school, she won an historic case that freed 35 people, most of them black, who'd been wrongfully convicted on drug charges, and she has overcome the toughest challenges to our basic civil rights. Today, she's here to dive into the latest threats to our freedoms and safeties, so let's please welcome to the stage former United States Associate Attorney General and my dear friend, Vanita Gupta. So, Vanita, thank you for being here.
It is really exciting to be here and to see such a full room. Thank you to TAAF and everyone who put this summit together, and thank you, Katie, for doing this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'd love to start with your childhood. You grew up in Philadelphia. You were the daughter of a businessman who immigrated to the United States. You went to college at Yale. You went to NYU for law school. These are just, you're ticking off all the boxes. So clearly you were supposed to become a big shot lawyer at a white shoe law firm, but instead you were drawn to social activism. Can you walk us through that decision making?
Yeah, you know, all of us live lives that aren't totally linear. If those of you had the goal of where you are today and you led your whole life that way, you can let me know. But I think that different things led me to do what I was doing. You know, one of my earliest memories, and it's a story that I talk about because I think it's important because we have so many things that shape our actual identity. But my father had gotten us transferred to England in the late 70s for his job. And this is one of my earliest memories. I was just shy of 5 years old. And my mother, sister, had gone to pick up with me, with my grandmother, who was visiting for the first time from India. So we went to Heathrow Airport. And she was wearing a sari, and she hadn't eaten on the flight because it was all non-vegetarian. And we took her, stopped by McDonald's on the way home, and right around this time in England was the rise of the skinhead kind of neo-Nazi movement in Britain. It was a resurgence of this. And we were sitting, eating our food, and a group of skinheads came down to sit next to us and started to throw French fries and bits of hamburger at our table. And they kept doing this, and they called us Paki, which is the derogatory word for South Asians in Britain, until we finally just got up and left. And I remember this, and I'm kind of sad that this is one of my earliest memories, but I remember this so vividly because rather than feeling kind of angry, I was just mortified. I was so embarrassed. And that whole experience, I think, really shaped how I kind of entered rooms, very subconsciously. I've only been able to understand this as I've gotten older, but growing up, I was always kind of looking around in restaurants or stores or places that, public places, wanting and hoping that there would be other people of color there to make me feel safe or to make it seem normal that we would be in a particular establishment. And I think that I grew up with that sense of both belonging and not belonging wherever I was. And it was just, I have never thought of doing anything much else than doing public service and public interest. And part of that is I just have been very kind of fundamentally concerned about issues of inequality and injustice and have been able and blessed to find pathways to do that work. Some people find that pathway later on. Some people do it from the private sector. There's all kinds of different ways to do it, but the way that I did it was by becoming a civil rights lawyer.
Sure, and when you were in college, you were a college activist. Obviously, everybody's been reading the news. We see a lot of campus activism today. I'm curious about what you think of the way that administrations have handled this moment in the United States of not just abundant conversation, but true activism coming from young people.
So Katie decided to start with a softball. Thank you, Katie, true New York Times reporter. So, look, I was a little bit of a rabble-rouser activist in college. I engaged in civil disobedience. I have worked at the American Civil Liberties Union for 8 years. I am a fervent believer in the importance of protests, and some of the great protest movements have been on campuses. The protest movement against the Vietnam War, and on and on and on. And even as an adult, I have organized protests and rallies. I marched against the family separation policies in the Trump administration and helped to organize them. I participated in the summer of 2020. I think it is incredibly important that this country, part of the First Amendment in our United States Constitution, is to protect freedom of speech. I also think that we have to make sure that in the course of doing that, I don't support breaking criminal laws or violence. I think nonviolent disobedience is so important. I think the messages we put out, my hope is that when protest movements exist, that they exist in a way that puts out messages to bring more and more people in rather than to exclude and alienate, because that is how you bring people in. So in this moment, I know it's a very small number of people, and they're the ones who get the news, whether they are outside agitators coming into student campuses or not. But messages that glorify 10/7 or Hamas, to me, are unacceptable and not a way to bring people in and to build the level of extreme concern and distress that a lot of us feel about the severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And so, Jewish students have to feel safe on campus, and campuses have a unique responsibility to ensure that students feel safe. So it is a very complex issue. I've also spent my whole life on policing and police tactics, and the decisions that campus administrators are making, when they are making them to call the police, have they tried to de-escalate or negotiate? These are things that I am thinking about a lot, and I know law enforcement leaders that lived through the summer of 2020 are thinking about it. A lot of them have been adequately, properly trained. I worry about how things can escalate. So it is we're living this out in real time right now. It's a time of a lot of tension. My hope is that there is also room for dialogue, because so much social media creates so much polarization. I know the prior panel really went into depth about some of these issues, and the inability to kind of recognize humans and opinions as things that we all share and things that need to be discussed. That is something that I think ultimately needs to be a part and feature of the very important and serious conversations that are happening right now in the country.
It's interesting. I think that one of your very first cases, or your very first case, was an act of coalition building in many ways, even though the press didn't cover it that way at the time. You were in Texas, you were working as a young lawyer, you were just out of law school, and you helped to overturn the wrongful convictions of dozens of black men in Tulia, Texas, who've been wrongfully convicted by a corrupt detective and an all-white jury of crimes they did not commit. Now, one of the interesting things about that case is that not only did it resonate very deeply with black Americans, it seemed to also have meaning for the South Asian community, which was not at that point in time thought of as an activist community, as a community that was deeply invested in civil rights. So how did that impact expectations around who cares about racial justice in America?
Yeah, I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund there, and my husband, who's in this audience, was also a civil rights lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund. It's where we met. And actually, when I first joined the organization, first of all, most of my parents and their friends thought I worked for the NCAA. So I had to kind of tell them about the organization I was working for. And then I would get questions, actually almost less from the Asian American community and the South Asian community, but often from white people who are like, why is a South Asian person interested in fighting for civil rights at a black organization? And in my head, I was like, you would never ask a white person that question, actually. And there were so many built-in assumptions to that. But to me, my family was in this country because of the civil rights movement and because of what African Americans, the sacrifices that were made by the civil rights movement. That was actually a broad coalition movement, but that I had to give back. And to me, some of the biggest questions around race and immigration were litigated by the Legal Defense Fund, and then in coalition with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and so many organizations that we all really stand on the shoulders of and that really tell our stories of our arrival into this country. And so it was important to me. The LDF is founded by Justice Thurgood Marshall, and to work there, what an honor. But all of the work I have ever done has been coalition work. The civil rights organization that I led from 2017 to 2021 is the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. 215 civil rights organizations are a part of this, the nation's oldest and largest civil rights coalition. To me, the way that we get things done is by building coalition. And I have worked also across the political spectrum to advance criminal justice reform with Grover Norquist and David Keene, people who would think, you have nothing in common, why are you there? With law enforcement, when I came into the Justice Department to head up the Civil Rights Division, it was right after Michael Brown had been killed in Ferguson. There were literally, unrest in cities all over the country. And I immediately reached out to law enforcement leaders and worked with them and have persisted to have very close relationships with law enforcement as we push for police reform. Because in my mind, I'm both a idealist, obviously, but I'm also a pragmatist. I think the way that you get solutions and you solve problems is not by kind of standing in your corner thinking that you have all of the answers yourself and people can either join you or you can cancel them. It is actually to be able to find those lines of common ground, to push, to bring people, to change hearts and minds, to change culture. And the only way to do that is actually to get out of your comfort zone and find new allies into the fight. So it was really important, and I'm very happy to say that when I was at LDF, or when I was in college, I remember doing a report on Asian American activism, and I found 5 leaders in New York that I could come and interview. And now it's every public interest organization, government, it's just incredible. We are everywhere, and we are doing this work really what I think is to make a more perfect union and to try to bring the ideals of the US Constitution to actually mean something for real people, and that only happens if all of us are invested in that fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that when Vanita was nominated to take on the most recent role she had at the Justice Department, it was extraordinary to see the breadth of people who wrote letters in support. It was not just civil rights leaders, it was not just Democrats, it was Republicans, it was the head of almost every policing organization in America who all believed deeply that for the toughest problems, you wanted somebody who was willing to respectfully speak to everybody. I mean, it was really extraordinary to see. So those are all on the internet if you want to read them.
You don't want to look at anything related to my confirmation, actually. It was not the most pleasant experience, but it was great to have this type of support. It really was.
Yeah, it's hard to be confirmed in a very divided Congress.
Yes.
But for that role, interestingly, it wasn't a civil rights role. You had been the acting head of the Civil Rights Division under Obama, but when Biden was president, he wanted you to do something really, really different and out of your comfort zone. So a lot of people don't know what the Associate Attorney General does. Also, at the Justice Department, everybody is an Attorney General of some sort. It's very confusing. You're a Deputy Attorney General, you're an Associate Attorney General. This version of the Attorney General was the number 3 official in the Justice Department. But here's the list of things that Vanita had to oversee, many of them not civil rights related. So you were responsible for all of the department's law enforcement and public safety policies and programs. You oversaw the antitrust division, all of our lawsuits over environmental issues, lawsuits over federal tax law, the Office of Violence Against Women, and the part of the Justice Department that defends the US government anytime it's taken to court, and the US government is sued all the time, not over civil rights issues. So how did you react to taking on basically a totally new role under very high profile circumstances, in a very high stakes job?
So it was first a great honor to serve. I was in that position for 3 years, and just shy of 3 years. And it was a huge portfolio. It was the first time, as Katie said, that a civil rights attorney was in a top 3 position at the Justice Department. And I think when I came in, I felt a little bit, it was kind of a learning for me, but I felt a little bit like an imposter or a fraud. I wasn't sure, just to be honest with all of you, that I had come in from what was a really tough confirmation with a lot of support, but the politics on the Hill were pretty ugly. And I had to kind of figure out and be very conscious of the fact that I actually did belong in the room, and that the fact of the matter of being a first, you can carry a lot of, it's very important, and I hope that there will be many behind me, but I had to kind of reprogram my brain a little bit to say, well, I was chosen as a civil rights leader to be in this room and to start my day at 9 a.m. every day with the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General talking about all of the biggest issues of the day for a reason. And that it wasn't that, oh, I would be marginalized because of my unique specialty that had never been in that room before, but that actually the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General needed my perspective. It's a shame, right, that there weren't more civil rights attorneys in top leadership, because I think what I was supposed to bring in the conversation is something that needs to be in these major, very important conversations, and that's perspectives of some of the most vulnerable and marginalized and dispossessed among us, or to be able to solve problems with the relationships that I had with law enforcement and civil rights communities. We were dealing with, and we still are, an epidemic of gun violence, and I had to spend a lot of time with the families in Uvalde, Texas, and Chicago, and Buffalo, New York, and Charleston, AME, and the work that I did with crime victims, but also we were dealing with the Dobbs decision, the very first time that in this country a constitutional right has been taken away by the Supreme Court, and what could we do to protect women's health care access, and hearing stories of women bleeding out in parking lots, unable to get emergency care at the hospitals in states that had total bans. We were dealing with policing issues where there was a violent crime was on the rise in 2020 and 2021, and how could we, and there was such a fundamental mistrust with law enforcement. There were a lot of issues, immigration, and I ended up kind of living into that role and living into my leadership. But I talk about, and I think it's important for leaders to be vulnerable, to talk about kind of how to come into these rooms and own your space and own your leadership. It was a process for me, and I am glad that I went through it, but I think it's also really important to be real about it.
What was the most important part of the process, or what was the key a key part or a difficult part of that process?
I think it was recognizing just how much the Justice Department was relying or needed to, needed my perspective and the relationships that I had built over time to be able to get things done. And it's a 24/7 job. You're moving from crisis to crisis, but you're also trying to advance policy change that you came in to do. And so I think that was just really key, was when I was in the rooms and meeting with the Uvalde families, I wasn't saying, God, why am I in this room? I was dealing with some of the most horrific things that humanity has had to see, and that's where you also it gets put into perspective. But I also had mentors and so much support inside the building from right on high through the workforce.
Mm-hmm. We are seeing now another resurgence in hate crimes and in hate, similar to the one that you described encountering when you were really young. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, just testified to this on the Hill, talking about the dramatic rise that we've seen, not just since the war in Gaza began, but basically over the last several years. So what is the Justice Department doing today that is combating that? And what can groups like TAAF do to meet that moment when we're seeing a really, really negative trend in terms of how people are treated?
Yeah, when we came in, the first thing that the Attorney General did was to commission a whole study on how the Justice Department could do more and work faster to deal with hate crimes. And it really helped. And I think there were a lot of you in this room with organizations that helped to get this done, but we got the COVID-19 anti-Asian hate legislation through Congress that gave the Justice Department many more resources to be able to deal with some of the kind of post-COVID spike in hate against our communities. But also there was a spike, anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Black attacks, anti-LGBTQ attacks, the rise of hate in part driven by the normalization of some very hateful rhetoric was something that we had to really contend with. And we knew, so obviously the Justice Department has a prosecution arm, and I think since January of 21, there's been the Justice Department's charged in over 125 cases, I believe, and 95 convictions, many of which relate to anti-Asian hate. But prosecutions and investigations is just a tip of the spear. We all have a responsibility to fight hate, and there's a lot of work on prevention. The Justice Department created this United Against Hate effort, all 94 U.S. attorneys' offices meeting regularly with community-based organizations, because while we were doing training with law enforcement about how to investigate hate crimes, the reality is there's vast underreporting. The communities most vulnerable to hate are often the ones that don't want to report to a government agency, let alone to a police department. And so the community-based work is actually, I think, the most crucial kind of set of solutions and strategies that we have to combat hate. And fundamentally, that work is local, because the federal government, we have grants. The Justice Department gives out $70 million now. We got an increase in our grant streams to community-based organizations to help support the work against hate. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it is going to come down to also all of us in the institutions that we are in the organizations that we're in, to actually building a more healthy discourse, to reaching out to people who don't look like us or share our ideas. And it's going to take all of this all together to actually be able to move forward. And we don't know what the future holds. And I would say that while there's been a great institutional and kind of governmental understanding of the role that the government needs to play, as I said, the thing that's going to anchor this is all of us in this room, far beyond whatever government changes or political tides take place.
Sure. So one, I would just like to point out what you said about the anti-Asian hate legislation that happened in the midst of a crisis. I think that really spoke to how important it is to have leaders who may have different political opinions, may want to fight it out over ideological items that are of importance to the country, but in a moment of crisis, we're willing to come together to get something done in a shared way. It just speaks to what you said earlier about wanting to build coalition. So as a last question, what should the people in this room, you just spoke about community building and local work, what should the people in this room be thinking about in terms of what it means to help the country move toward a safer and more just place?
So what worries me the most right now is the degree of cynicism and despair that can set in, and there's a lot to be deeply concerned about with our country at this moment. But I also always draw upon historical perspective to actually understand and ground the moment that we are in. When you think, some people say, our country's so polarized, we will never get back from the brink. I'm like, well, we did fight a civil war over some key kind of foundational precepts of this country, namely slavery and what kind of country we wanted to be. And we were able, in a time of great brutality, to be able to, build a country that, has continued to work on trying, as I said, to have the promise of our Constitution become more real for people all over this country. I think about the fight against Jim Crow and Reconstruction and all of the challenges that have imposed our way. And ultimately, the only thing that has ever made a difference to pushing for progress in sometimes the most difficult of times has been men, women, young people refusing to accept the status quo and willing to do the work. When we sit around and hope that truly, when we sit around and hope that our democracy is going to protect itself, or we just give up on the institution of democracy and say, you know what, this whole system is so rigged, nothing's going to work, and there's going to be no progress made, we're not going to vote, we're just going to sit it all out. That is what confounds me the most, because that is giving up on this country. And I have a lot of optimism. I really believe that there is a resilience because of all that this country has been through. But the resilience and progress, and indeed our democracy, are not going to protect themselves. It's a high stakes game right now. And we have to see ourselves as democracy workers. I hope all of us will go out there and monitor the polls and be poll watchers and help deal with the machinery of our democracy that is so under threat, literally under threat, where election administrators and poll workers who volunteer to help us all vote are receiving death threats. And threats such that they cannot and don't feel comfortable now signing up for the job. That's going to require all of us to see ourselves as democracy workers and to not just wait for things to happen and for our democracy to protect itself. It's also going to mean that when people feel so disenfranchised and disillusioned and just want to sit it out, we need to be out there talking about to our communities about why this matters, and that why sitting it out is actually, I think, a way to just give up. I don't think that that's pushing for the types of solutions that we need to see. We need to look inward in our community. I remember after Tulia that there were parents or young kids that were coming up to me and they were like, God, you made public interest work acceptable. You made civil rights work acceptable, and now I'm going to be able, my parents now see a model for this. But part of the work that I was also doing when I was doing that work was asking and speaking in these types of rooms, talking about the racism in our community, talking about the anti-LGBTQ sentiments in our community, the ways in which our communities exclude people and can, really create their own hegemony in a lot of ways. And so I hope that all of us will see ourselves as part of this democracy. It's an experiment, and it will go away, believe me, if we all give up on it. And I think that this is a crucial time. We are at an inflection point to determine what kind of country we want to be. And I am optimistic that people will find their path to understanding how to be active workers for our democracy and for what this country can truly be. So I want to thank you all for coming out here. The fact that you're in this room at all shows that you care deeply about some of the hardest questions that our country is facing. And it's been a real honor to be here this morning. Thank you.
So thank you again, Vanita, for being here. This was such a great conversation. I feel like everybody learned so much. Thank you again to TAAF for hosting us, because this is an important summit. And up next, we're going to learn about our history then and now, the power of the AANHPI education movement, and find out all the new ways that our history is coming alive. So I hope you stick around, and thank you.